Hi, everyone. I'm Carol Mertz, the Executive Director of Pixelpop Festival, and I'm really happy to introduce the last session of the day, Apart, the socially distant virtual reality art show, presented by Ethan Mahalachek and James Kane. Ethan is a Pixelpop alum and a recent graduate from Maryville University's Interactive Design and Game Design program, and he's since been working at Paradowski Creative as an immersive technology engineer, creating everything from VR farm tours to web games to kiosk applications and storytelling via augmented reality. James is a creative technologist focused on immersive development, design, and evangelism, whose Webby nominated VR AR work with Fortune 500 corporations, startups, and academic researchers has been featured by a number of global events and organizations. So, with that, please give a warm welcome to Ethan and James.
Hello, Pixelpop. Thanks for having us. How's everyone doing today? I'm James Kane, uh,
And I'm Ethan Mahalachek.
and we represent Paradowski's immersive tech team at Paradowski Creative. We're a full-service marketing and advertising agency with a strong focus on 3D, essentially 3D game dev for marketing. And we're also early adopters of AR VR tech. Uh, This is the story of Apart. It's a social distancing themed community poster show and multiplayer virtual gallery space comprising 150 original works from designers around the world. It's permanently accessible in virtual reality and via web browsers, and all the proceeds we made selling prints benefit the World Health Organization's COVID-19 Relief Fund.
So in this talk, we're going to just kind of give an overview of what we made. So that includes the ideation, designing, building, launching, all that stuff as it pertains to this virtual space. We're going to get a little technical, talk about the workflow and the tech that we actually used to create the project. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the impact that it had. Impact that it had on us as a company, the impact that it had on us as individuals, and the impact that it had on our community.
Sounds great. So yeah, let's set the stage a bit. I'm gonna take us back to late February, early March. Our team, again, we're early adopters of AR VR tech, and we had months of community events organized, including an in-person AR VR art show with local creators and a multiplayer mixed reality experience with custom hardware that was supposed to debut at the St. Louis Science Center on March 12th. And of course, we all know what happened. The pandemic hit, and all in-person events were canceled indefinitely. So uh, immediately, we had to start thinking about how does our strategy shift, and what is our team working on for the next several months instead. And so I think very quickly we came around to the idea of these networked virtual spaces. If you want to toggle the next one. Yeah, so there's a lot of talk lately about Zoom fatigue and people being sick of doing the video conferencing thing. It's hard for more than one person to hold the floor in these video conferences, and it's just not that fun often. So one thing we immediately found was there are a bunch of services offering networked social spaces in 3D, avatar based experiences where you create your online persona and you navigate a 3D world. Um, One of the coolest things about these spaces is the realistic spatial audio. So that works just like in real life, where the farther away from someone you are, the quieter their voice chat is going to be. So that might sound simple, but what it allows is for natural groups to form, just like you would in a real life conference space. Maybe a small group forms over here and a small group forms over here. And while you're in the same space, you can still have these network effect conversations that's really hard to happen in a traditional video conference. And I know that even in our development process, some of the meetings we had in these spaces were some of the most fun meetings, work meetings I've ever been a part of. So that was really cool to see. So there are a few options of this, like alt space, rec room, VR chat, high fidelity. Um, Most of these are pretty VR centric. You need a headset, although Rec Room and Alt Space have since released what we would call pancake or 2D versions that you can play just like you would play a normal first person perspective game. Um, but the thing about them is none of them are open source. If you want to create a truly custom experience, there's just going to be limitations to what you can do. So this is where we enter Mozilla Hubs. Mozilla Hubs is an amazing software stack. It's open source. It's completely free to use. It works on mobile, on desktop, on VR. It's accessible through a web browser. It also offers what's called the Hubs Cloud architecture, which basically allows self-hosting on AWS. It comes with its own 3D CMS as well, and it's based on a technology called A-Frame, which itself is based on 3JS. Pretty common in the WebGL, Web3D world. But building on top of these initial building blocks. And they also have a great community support and Discord channel to where if you are developing a custom version of the client, there's just an amazing amount of support you can get from their developers and such. So again, immediately we're looking into these spaces and doing R&D around network social avatar based spaces. In parallel to our work on these network 3D spaces, we work at a design agency, and almost immediately our creatives were responding to the pandemic in the way they know how, which is to make art together. And so what started as the original poster design on the left there, Flatten the Curve, Stay Home, that was created by our boss, the VP of Creative Tech, Andy Wise, uh, quickly snowballed into a open community source design challenge, essentially, where designers from around the world were reacting to the pandemic by creating these posters and submitting them. And the whole idea was we were going to sell prints and donate all of the proceeds to the World Health Organization. So very quickly it went from a couple of people just instinctively creating art to this community challenge that what we feel was really well received and produced a lot of great designs. Uh, so our thought immediately was, how can we combine these two things? How can we combine the network virtual space and this amazing design challenge that our creatives are working with? So if you want to tackle next, we came up with this idea to create a virtual gallery, and it was going to be multiplayer, going to be, again, accessible on mobile, on desktop, in VR. And we curated all the designs into 8 themed rooms, including a 360 video dome in the wall of creators in the lobby. Um, we created original avatars, original animations, and sound designs, and we even had docents staffing the museum on opening night in order to kind of show people around and explain what this was all about. What you're seeing here is the Hall of Heroes, which focused on first responders and kind of the essential workers that are out there putting their health on the line for everyone else's benefit. And so how did we do this exactly? Well, there are several steps to the process, but our most important tool was Blender 3D. And I'll turn it over to Ethan to kind of walk through our technical art process.
Yeah. So during the whole process, I was doing most of the 3D work on this project, and so Blender was just sort of the natural choice for us to go with for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's free, it's open source, and it's something that I've been using for many years myself. But in addition to that, it is also the most compatible 3D software currently with hubs. So it just kind of made it the natural choice to use for this project. So we went through a couple of steps in order to get this design out of our heads and into reality. The first part of the process was taking some sketches and creating a gray box design. And what that looks like in 3D is basically a bunch of gray boxes that you can walk through. And in our case, we actually walk through in hubs, so in VR and on our desktop computers, so we could actually get a feel for what the space was going to be like. Next, we went into a design phase where we had some of our designers at the company who came up with some really interesting and unique designs on a per room basis. And we took these designs and we applied them to some mood boards, and we applied them to the 3D models themselves, and came up with just kind of a 3D representation of these very fantastical spaces. The next step of the process was placement. So we have all of these posters, and we kind of categorized them in such a way that it would be easy to see some sort of connection between the posters that they were next to. And then we were putting each of these categories into their own separate room that had a theme. So placing all of these posters along with the plaques that went with them, so the info plaques with the names and the titles, was no small task because there were 154 individual posters and plaques, and they all had to be placed by hand. So that took a while, but it was well worth it in the end. Textures and materials was next. So that was taking the designs that our designers had come up with and actually putting them into action in the 3D world. Getting the textures and materials set up for something like hubs is quite interesting because everything has to be set up very particularly, or else it will not work. And I'll get a little bit more into that later. Optimization. Optimization is huge for anything on the web because not only do your clients or whoever's connecting or your users, whatever you want to call them, not only do they have to download everything that you see, but they also have to stream it and they have to run it within a browser, which has its own overhead. So there's a lot of processing going on that you don't even really think about when you're using something like WebGL. So we had to make this as optimized as we could. Now, from a modeling standpoint, this was pretty easy because everything was very low poly. Not so much from a texture standpoint, because if you remember, we have 154 posters we're trying to show here, and we don't want to, reduce them to Minecraft levels of detail. So that probably wasn't as optimized as it could have been, but you live and you learn. Second to last, we have light baking. And light baking was very important to this whole experience because light baking allowed us to essentially take realistic lighting and give our whole space sort of a very atmospheric feel to it. Instead of the flat colors that you might expect going into a space like this, or even the harsh shadows that you would get from some real-time lighting, we had very soft, glowy, sunny lighting in this whole space that transitioned to and from more moody spaces or darker areas. And this was only possible by baking our lights. And then finally, we have exporting, which it sounds small, but it's kind of its own little mini subsection because you have to make sure that all of your settings are correct and all your optimizations are correct. And then as soon as you hit export, you might find that you did 50 things wrong and then have to go back and change them. So I'm just going to go through a few screenshots and talk over them a little bit from the process. So here on the left, you see that we have some of our basic avatars in hubs and some of our team members, and we're just looking at some of the initial gray box stages of this development. So nothing special, just getting a feel for the space, getting a feel for scale. And on
I would say that it's a critical stage though, because especially in terms of being in a VR headset in these spaces, I mean, it really puts you in the room at lifelike proportions. Your avatar is about 1.7 meters tall, and so the height of the room and the scale of everything really comes into play here, and that's how we kind of really nailed the layout and the structure of everything.
Right. And this is especially true if you experience it in VR, because not only is your avatar at the correct scale, but now you are at the correct scale and you actually feel like you're in a properly scaled environment. And then on the right here, we have this is actually a screenshot taken from the end of the development process, but it shows sort of like the layout. It's a wireframe of the layout of the entire space, shows where all the lights live, shows how the rooms sort of interconnect to each other. But I think what it shows the best is just how optimized we had to make the geometry in order to get it to work for this space. Here we have some of the setup for doing some of the light baking, which I was talking about earlier. So if you look at the ceiling here with the little grid at the top, you can see that it has sort of like a sky texture coming through. In the final result, and I can actually go back real quick to the title page so you can see this a little bit better. But all of the lighting in the room is actually coming from that source. So it is entirely environmentally lit. And we were able to pull that off because of light baking. So light baking process, essentially, it means that you take any light sources in your scene and then you bake them onto the textures that will then be used in the scene. So in the final scene, we're not actually exporting any lights. We're just taking the lighting information and applying it to the model itself. Now, normally, if we were doing this in like a game engine or something, we would have done this a little bit differently than the way we did. The way we had to do it was actually take the lighting info and essentially plaster it on top of the textures that we wanted to use. This, unfortunately, led to slightly less than optimal resolutions for some of our textures that we used, but overall, it got the point across, and I think it was fairly successful. It also had a little bit of extra performance overhead as a result. But nowadays, now that Hubs has come along even further since we've made this, there is proper light map support. So won't have to do that any longer. And then here we have just another view of the space. You can see it textured a little bit, and you can see some of the shader node setup that we had going on. And then over here on the bottom left, you can see some of the posters. And so the way that we had to handle the posters was essentially take and combine them into single textures and put as many posters as we could reasonably on one texture, and then slice up that plane and distribute it across the entire room. So that happened several times throughout the entire project. And that is just one of the many optimizations that we had to do in order to get this thing up and running. And then finally here, this just sort of goes to show some of the design side and just some of the thought that went into designing these spaces. Now, this is a space that I did not design it myself. One of our designers did, but I was the one who took and sort of placed everything in the room. And as you can see, it is, not your typical room. It is very fantastical, very out there. And that was the goal of this project, was just to make something that was unique.
Particularly, this is the humor room. So this is all artists and designers reacting to the pandemic with, a little bit of comedic relief, a little bit. And that's why we get that kind of surreal, like dad's basement den look with the furniture on the roof and everything. So this was a fun one for sure.
Now, when it comes to doing the light baking, it's not fast because in the end, it still is rendering. And if you've ever even looked a little bit into 3D rendering, then you know that it can be a very lengthy process. And I was working on my local machine at the time, which is definitely an okay machine, but for the scale that we were working at, it wasn't really enough. So James, he can talk a little bit more about this, but he went to Amazon EC2 and spun up an on AWS and spun up in Linux instance. And James, why don't you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure, yeah. So, like with about a week to go before we were, had a deadline to launch the show. I realized that my UI customizations were pretty minimal, mostly just reducing the stock UI hubs came with, and the hub's cloud hosting setup it works through an AWS CloudFormation template, which makes things fairly automated, even though you're setting up this pretty complex software stack. So I realized with about a week to go, the best thing I could do for the team was to buy more time for design and technical art. And we were looking, on one or two local machines, we were looking at a, potentially 2 or 3 day light baking process. So that would have meant we would have had to have wrapped design at least 3 days before the show, which increasingly looked like it wasn't going to happen. Keep in mind, this was a volunteer project for our agency and really just, not for a client, not for pay, just something we were fitting into our regular workload. So we looked into options for like light baking on render farms, but we're not rendering anything, right? We're not making stills. We're not rendering out animated video or anything. So no one really offers this service. And moreover, there's so many like particular settings that had to be dialed in just so that it wasn't really an option. So what we ultimately were able to do was to create these P3 instances that are basically supercomputers in the cloud. And you can kind of see some of the stats that these offer, like 128 gigabytes of GPU memory, 64 virtual CPUs. Um, and there is an hourly the more capable these get, there is an hourly cost associated with them. But it was going to basically save us 2 days of design time by going this route. So we were able to spin up. It still took hours, but if you click to the next slide, you can kind of see what we were able to do is create basically a desktop GUI instance of Blender that we were able to access from a web browser. And you can see all those Tesla V100 GPUs at 16 gigabytes each. We had 8 of them. Uh, and that, along with the high speed processor, really sped up this development process and bought the design team and Ethan more time to fill out the space and make it as great looking as possible. So that was kind of an interesting 11th hour Hail Mary there. And I think it ended up working out quite well.
Yeah, definitely.
So, fast forward to opening night. We had our Paradowski staff as docents in this space. The, there is a maximum number of people you can fit into one space due to both server side and client side bottlenecks. It ends up being around 25 or 30 people. But what we can do is create as many spaces as we need to, and as many copies of our space as we needed to, and kind of auto route traffic between them as people come and go through the rooms. So here you can kind of see some of our coworkers, youngins, getting in on the fun. Our boss described it as watching distance dissolve as folks kind of came together in this space and enjoyed exploring with each other. And I think that's a really beautiful way to put it. So if you want to click to the next one. So just kind of starting to summarize, over the course of 4 or 5 weeks, we sold 600 posters, raised over 15,000 for the dollars for the WHO. On our opening weekend alone, we had 1,250 unique visitors, plus 350 returning visitors. And they stayed for an average of 4 minutes and 50 seconds each, which is solid for if you're used to dealing with web metrics. I think that's a really cool statistic to see for us. And it surpassed my expectations as far as the reception. I can say that it was a hit. We got the Mozilla Hubs team themselves involved. They were really excited to see this kind of application of their tech stack, and we kind of just found them wandering as a group, talking about everything and kind of analyzing how we analyzing our creative choices. Really, eventually we were able to collaborate with them and host a couple meetings in the space with their community. Maybe one of which you can see right there. And since again, I can't say enough about the Mozilla Hubs team. They are super supportive of anyone who's trying to use this tech to bring people together. So kudos to them. And there's a YouTube link there if anybody's curious to watch that meetup and learn a little more. As well, we were interviewed by Kent Bai of the Voices of VR podcast. And if you're interested in AR VR tech, I highly recommend this podcast. He's been doing it for years and years now. I started listening in 2016, and then it had already been going for a couple of years. And Kent is a great resource for that kind of thing. So it was really cool to talk to him, and really cool to get his feedback on the show and some of the design decisions we made. And there's a link there to the interview as well. Um, Ethan, did you want to add anything else as far as like your takeaways from this project? And yeah, what was your reaction to everything that?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I was kind of blown away by how much people enjoyed it. Until you actually get a response from people when you work on something like this, like you don't really realize the impact that it has on others. So that was just really cool to experience from you know a different perspective than I'm usually on. Like I'm usually on the side of the one who's receiving those things and not presenting them. So that was a really cool perspective to have. Definitely looking forward to any opportunity where I get to do that again. Yeah, just overall, just a very fun project to work on. Really glad that we did it.
Yeah, we've seen a ton of client interest for our agency, since we put this out there. I think, and we had even pitched stuff like this prior to the release of this show, and I think it was harder for people to imagine what it could be, what it could look like. But once we actually put this out there, and they saw how realistic it could be, and how beautiful these spaces can be, how meaningful the interaction between people can be, uh, we've seen a huge surge in client and creative team interest in doing more stuff like this. And we have a project coming up with AIGA. the Professional Graphic Artists Association, that I think we're going to apply a lot of this learning to, and take it even farther with some of the advancements that the Hubs team's put in place since then. Um, and just, for me, I'll say, as someone who, I'm living alone through all this pandemic madness, and for me, this is just so meaningful to come together with the team, and to, I think for 3 or 4 weeks there, this was our total focus, and it was just so meaningful to me to collaborate with everyone on it, and I couldn't be more thrilled with the outcome either. So um, and that said, it's still available. It will be permanently accessible at apartposters.com. We probably should have linked that here, but hey, no big deal. Permanently accessible, kind of a monument to the project and to all the great designers' work that we were able to display and contribute back to the WHO with. So um, I think that's about it. I think that wraps it up. But thanks for everyone for hearing about the project, and certainly reach out to either myself or Ethan if you have any questions, or want to learn more. And we're always happy to engage about stuff like this.
Yep.
Awesome.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.